Hello, everyone, and welcome to our video series on some of the great founders, industries, technologies that are taking place across the US and across the world. I'm here with Matt with Aalo Atomics. Matt is one of the smartest and most innovative and thoughtful founders I know in the space of nuclear energy, and really appreciate having you on, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Fantastic. Well, today we're going to dive into a couple of topics around nuclear. We're going to tackle some misconceptions. We're going to talk about what's happening right now, what the future may look like. And this is an area that we're really excited about here at Alumni Ventures. So I think a great place to start, Matt, would be just why should people care about nuclear? Why should people be researching and learning about kind of this energy source, this energy storage source, and how does it stack up against other sources of energy that we may know in the world today?
Yeah. So for me, I studied engineering and physics. So I kind of had a background in understanding the science behind, solar and batteries and fission and fusion. But it wasn't until the past few years when I started really diving into the political and economic and kind of more mass psychological sides of these things. And the more I looked into nuclear, the more I felt like it was just essentially the most misunderstood energy source out of them all by a long shot. I've almost never seen something where there's such a huge disparity between the public perception of something and a lot of the realities. And so, if we kind of look at the different energy sources one by one, all the others they're fine, they're decent, but nuclear is just kind of so much better in all these different interesting dimensions that people don't really understand. So, solar and wind, these are great, they're clean. However, they don't work everywhere and they don't work all the time. And so if you're at like a more northern latitude or somewhere where it's cloudy fairly often, it's really hard to build economical utility scale plants that can compete with thermal baseload style energy sources. If you're in Australia or California or even parts of Texas, then solar can be great, but it does have these limitations. And if you want to make it baseload, you've got to do overbuilding and storage, and it just gets complicated. So there's that. It's not quite a silver bullet as many people would have you believe. And then you've got things like obviously oil and gas. Oil and gas is actually pretty cheap and reliable, but as we know, they don't really take accountability of their waste. They basically just spew it out into the air, and for some reason we're all cool with that, which we probably shouldn't be. And obviously with things like climate change or smog and hospitalizations with asthma, that's just been something that's becoming more prevalent in the general psyche as a problem, and that's definitely a major thing that's driving a lot more attention to nuclear. And then you've got things like geothermal or hydro, which again are good, they're fine, but they're kind of limited based on geography. So if you're not next to somewhere with really fast moving water or some kind of magma pocket close to the surface of the earth, then it's kind of tricky, and we've already tapped out quite a few of those locations. So with nuclear, it produces clean energy. It produces that energy whenever you want it. And contrary to popular belief, it can do that very economically, and it's already statistically just as safe as solar or wind. So to me, nuclear is just this insanely cool underdog that we should be leveraging much more. And yeah, that's my thought on that.
No, it's fantastic. And it leads to this next question of, it feels almost, it's this underdog kind of like energy source. It's this, sleeping giant. I think we feel like, that know this space. It hasn't always been that way, right? It's definitely an industry that's gone through some rocky periods, both like public perception, regulation, policy. What's different about right now? What's different between, our nuclear and our grandfather's nuclear? And then what pieces of that, you touched on this, but what pieces of that kind of made it so exciting for you to jump in with the company that you're building?
I think you're right to point out nuclear has gone through a bit of a roller coaster with regards to adoption and public perception and so on. And for those who don't know, so nuclear energy research began in the 40s and 50s, and we saw the first deployments in the 50s and 60s. And that was kind of the dawn of the first atomic age. So we saw roughly 52, 53 different test reactors built at Idaho National Lab to explore nuclear technology and learn. And then during the slowdown of nuclear in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, INL, they pared that down to 3. So it went from 52 or 53 down to 3. And what we're seeing is right now there's a resurgence, a start of a second atomic age. And I think this is driven by a few things. So on the one hand, you've got people increasingly realizing that their fear of nuclear power might be a little bit misplaced. Fear of nuclear weapons is totally valid and fair, but people are just kind of now realizing just how different and separate these two things are, nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. And not only that, but we're also realizing that climate change and decarbonization is increasingly pressing, and nuclear is just such an obvious, incredible solution for that, and we've just been ignoring it. And by the way, not everyone has been ignoring it. So Ontario fully decarbonized their grid in the 70s and 80s. Obviously, France also did, and they did an amazing job with their build out. And then you've seen other places that have tried to go, all in on renewables, like Germany, and that hasn't quite worked as well just yet. So that's essentially what's driving it. The other side is also on the political side. We've seen a huge amount of momentum towards nuclear. So at the COP climate conference 2 or 3 years ago, nuclear was not even mentioned. But this past year, there were 20 countries that signed on to triple their nuclear capacity by 2050. So we're seeing the governments respond to the public shifting tides of perception. And I think what, in large part drove a lot of this is a small group of nuclear advocates. You've seen different folks, down to groups of 5, 10 people who have saved entire gigawatt scale nuclear power plants. And they've similarly been, voicing their opinion about nuclear quite loudly on, social media like TikTok and Twitter or X, YouTube, you name it. And there's a really strong change in the tides of perception just based on that small movement alone. So a bunch of these things are changing, and I think nuclear is in for a pretty interesting expansion period in the coming decades.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And you touched on, this changing both the political landscape, but then also public perception. And I want to just address some of these kind of public pieces head on. When you talk about nuclear to a layman, to just average person, the first concerns are safety and waste. To the point that I'm at now, and I kind of understand this industry, I have pretty good answers there, and it was a total shift in kind of my mindset on nuclear. But can you just talk about that? Because those are the biggest fears for, I think, a lot of people. Maybe they go past an old reactor. They're like, thank God I don't live near this, right? But safety and waste has changed and not changed in a lot of ways, but the perception is different than reality here.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's important not to dismiss people's fears as meaningless, but at the same time, it's important for people to kind of look to the numbers and not just rely on hearsay or their emotions about certain things. So, the first thing to point out is nuclear is statistically as safe as solar or wind. If you look at it on a, deaths per kilowatt hour basis, which is kind of morbid, but it's, a good way to look at it. But really, there's kind of two main sides to people's fears about nuclear. The first side is the waste, and the second side is meltdowns. And so I think, the waste side actually is a little bit more of a misunderstanding or misplaced fear. I think the fear of meltdowns can almost be rephrased as a fear of relocation or a fear of impacting the environment. Because it might, surprise people to kind of realize that out of the 3 major nuclear accidents people have heard of, the past 2, nobody died. This is Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. In 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, nobody died. However, just the whole idea of a relocation, as we saw in Fukushima, kind of turns people off. And obviously, we want to get around that. But with the waste issue, this is what's really interesting. So the first point is there's such a small amount of nuclear waste. So you take all the waste ever produced in the history of nuclear power worldwide, and it all fits on a football field stacked 10 meters high. This might sound like a lot, but if you compare this to oil and gas or something, like if you took out all the waste that industry has ever produced, it would fill an entire city, and it would be like a mountain stacked like as high as Mount Everest. This is a huge, huge thing, and if you've ever gone to see nuclear waste in person, you're kind of left saying like, is that it? It's not some green goo that's leaky and hard to contain. It's very easy to contain, and you actually want to keep it on site because most of the energy content is still in there. So, nuclear waste is essentially like taking a bite out of a sandwich and setting it aside. 95% of the energy content is still in there. So we actually don't want to go and bury it deep beneath a mountain or send it off into outer space. We want to keep it close by because it's so easy to handle. There's such a small amount of it, and there's actually good resources in there to use again in the future. So the waste issue, I think, is interestingly a bit of a talking point. You might ask yourself, why do we fear waste if all that is true? And I think the waste was actually a bit of a talking point contrived by people who wanted to end all things nuclear. They wanted to end the weapon, and they thought, if we're going to end the weapon, we have to end the energy source. And it turns out that's just not true. Both that assumption about ending both and throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but also the assumption that waste is quite dangerous. So that's my take on the waste issue. But I think the fear of meltdowns, even though they're very uncommon, I think is valid because you don't want to, even if it happens, once every 20, 30 years, you don't want to have to relocate. And so what we're doing at Aalo is we're trying to make reactors that essentially are, relocation proof. So if there's anything, obviously technology can never be 100% perfect, but what you can do is engineer the system such that if there's anything that goes wrong, anything that happens is just contained in the building. And we're looking forward to proving that out in the next couple of years with deployment and demonstration of some test reactors.
That's fantastic. And I mean, if we are as interesting as I think we are, and people like go want to learn more about nuclear after listening or watching to this, one of the things they'll see in a lot of these kind of advanced reactors or new reactors is the term meltdown proof. And you guys are looking at it as kind of relocation proof. There's the term meltdown proof, and I think it touches on maybe this broader question of what's happening in nuclear on the reactor side today. With some of these advanced reactors that maybe wasn't even technically possible, a few decades ago, where these reactors don't necessarily look the same as the reactors that you picture in your mind or you see in media. Talk a little bit about kind of the landscape and maybe some of these technical advancements that have done things in the way of efficiency and safety, or even waste, even if it's not this kind of huge problem that many people think it is.
So yeah, first I'll address the fuel side. So our reactors are going to use a fuel called uranium zirconium hydride. And so this is a really interesting fuel that's often used actually in university research reactors. So people don't often realize there's 30 of these things around the US on university campuses. And students walk by these things without realizing they're walking right next to a nuclear reactor. And the reason they don't know is because there's not a big concrete dome over the reactor. And the reason that is because the fuel is so inherently safe. So the students are allowed to essentially try to make the fuel melt down, and they can't because the fuel has an inherent physics property where the hotter it gets, the less reactive it gets. And so this is the fuel that we're using for our reactors to help simplify some of the civil structure and shrink down that engineering and cost to a physics level. But you might ask yourself, why did we not use this type of fuel for other reactors around the world today? And the reason is because this fuel is finicky. So all the water-based reactors around the world, they aren't able to take heat away from the fuel fast enough, and the fuel basically shuts itself off too quickly. But with our reactors, because we use liquid metal, we're able to take that heat away super quick. When you touch a metal, it feels cold to the touch, not because it's actually cold, but because it's taking the heat away from your hand very quickly. So by using liquid metal with this fuel, it's an amazing combination for our reactors because it's simultaneously incredibly energy dense, which is great for economics, but also incredibly inherently safe, which is a good thing on its own, but also good for economics because you shrink down those safety systems. In terms of other big differences with reactors today versus the reactors of the future. So if you look at utility scale nuclear, 60 to 80% of the cost is capex, and a large chunk of that is interest. And the reason for that is because these reactors take 5 to 7 years to build in a best case, and you have to borrow a lot of money, and it compounds year after year after year that you don't make revenue. So there's this vision in nuclear where if instead of building one or two huge plants, you build 10 or 20 much smaller reactors, then you could start to make money much faster because these would be much quicker to install. And for the same reason that your Tesla doesn't have one big battery cell, it has hundreds of small ones. If there's an issue with one small reactor, you can keep the rest operating. It helps with redundancy and a bunch of other stuff. The challenge, because this is not an easy thing to do, is this might actually save you a lot of capex, but then inflate your operational expenses, your OPEX. And so the engineering challenge is how do you automate the maintenance and refueling and so on and share turbines such that you keep both sides of that equation low. And maybe a good analogy for this is SpaceX. Everyone knew that a good way to lower the cost of rockets is to not throw them away, just reuse the rocket. But it took SpaceX to come along and actually prove it and do it. And similarly, in nuclear, lots of people have this idea of doing these SMRs or microreactors for utility scale power, but no one has come along and actually delivered on that yet and proven just how much you can lower economics with that solution. So if you ask me, that's a possible path for the future of utility scale nuclear that we might see unfold in the coming decades.
So it's almost this kind of distributed network per se, right, of smaller reactors that cost less to build. They're faster to build. So if you are taking out financing on it, those interest payments don't, add up the way they would with these large scale reactors. Is this leading towards a future where like there are small reactors, on top of hospitals or like apartment buildings? Like what is this kind of going towards, or is this still something that's going to happen for the majority of Americans and people worldwide still behind the scenes?
Well, yeah, I think you kind of touched on what might actually happen first, which is eventually we might see these utility scale plants leverage this solution. But the problem is utilities are very risk averse and very slow moving. So, they do not want to take a big risk because that can be a balance sheet risk for the entire entity. And so where we might see a lot of these microreactors deployed first, and certainly the markets that we're targeting first, are the long tail of behind the grid applications that are much like what you just said. So that could include data centers. That's a huge growth area. I think I heard of a data center for an AI training facility that will be a gigawatt, which is crazy. That's like 1 million homes worth of energy. And then a bunch of other smaller data centers for internet and other types of machine learning. And then there's also, for example, EVs. So if you imagine, if we're actually going to electrify all the vehicles, that's a huge, huge challenge. You would have to double or triple the entire grid to power all those cars and trucks and buses. People don't realize, just how much more energy that would require. Right now, EVs are still a very small fraction of cars on the road. And secondly, this is a distributed energy challenge. This is not a centralized challenge. So cars on the road, there's a network of roads all around the country. And so you want to have little microreactors that are just as safe as university research reactors all along the interstate. And that also saves you building a ton of new centralized generation capacity. And it saves you building a ton of transmission. And, funnily enough, people have NIMBYism about everything, not just nuclear, but even simple old transmission wires. So to us, this is another major application. And like you said, maybe one day hospitals or local neighborhoods, even remote communities, desalination plants. I mean, the list goes on. There's a pretty thick long tail of applications. And I think as utilities see this get deployed in the next 10 years, we're going to see much more utility scale applications as well.
Gotcha. And I want to kind of bring this into a lot of this is there's some political motivations here. There's obviously regulation, there's policy. The sentiment there is changing. I want to put this in almost a geopolitical context. What's kind of happening across the world? You mentioned places like France. You've mentioned other countries and regions that have maybe made more of an effort to bring nuclear into their grids. or places that have, refused it. Um, where does a country like the U.S. kind of stand globally um, in its nuclear development or its kind of interest in bringing nuclear, into our energy grids?
So the US is definitely still doing pretty well in terms of the number of reactors it has live, although there has been an unfortunate set of plants which have been attempted to be closed, and luckily the nuclear advocates have kept those alive. But internationally, we're seeing Russia, China, South Korea are kind of creeping ahead in terms of their ability to deploy anything from large scale traditional nuclear plants, which were kind of invented in the US, all the way to what's called advanced reactors, which use different types of coolants and fuels to achieve different characteristics like what we talked about with inherent safety. So these other countries are definitely getting ahead, and we have to make sure that we catch up. I mean, one big part of this is the research reactor angle, because for schools in the U.S. to train the next generation of nuclear operators and scientists and nuclear engineers, we need those research reactors and probably need more of them. But certainly, in a lot of ways, we're playing catch up now with those other countries. Yeah.
Fantastic. Cool. So we're still kind of a leader, but like everyone is moving up. I think people are waking up and kind of understanding that this needs to be, a crucial piece of this broader energy transition. It's not a knock against solar or wind or hydro, right? It's all kind of be a piece of this big puzzle. But there are definitely advantages here that are really exciting.
I think one other thing that I'd love to touch on is I think a lot of people don't realize just how little progress we've made in decarbonization. So we see news articles about how solar deployment or wind deployment is doubling or tripling, how many batteries we're selling. But if you look at a graph of the grid, it looks somewhat promising. You say, oh, look, we've got 20 or 30% decarbonized grids globally. But the grid is a very small fraction of energy that we use globally. And energy, if you look at that, only 5 or 10% is clean. The rest is still natural gas, coal, and other oil and gas forms. And this is just a huge, huge challenge that people don't really understand how much we still have to do. So it's great that we're getting accelerating, solar and wind and more batteries, but we need more of everything. And like I said at the start, nuclear truly is the most versatile solution to this problem. So I think we need a lot more of it.
We indeed need a lot more of it, and that leads to kind of the final topic here. Is there's a handful of companies that are really kind of pushing the envelope on what it means to kind of create these scalable reactors, do it efficiently, and do it sooner than maybe expected. So tell us kind of the origin story of Aalo, where you guys are at now, and what the long-term vision is for the company and how it's going to have an impact on kind of this entire nuclear energy transition.
We identified a regulatory catch-22 that has been somewhat slowing down a lot of the advanced reactor deployments worldwide. And what that is the regulators, they want you to have nuclear test data before they grant you a license, but you can't get that test data without a license. And so what we identified is while a bunch of companies are trying to build scaled down test reactors, the difficult thing is none of these will be revenue generating. And so what we found is there's actually a government reactor called MARVEL, which is the first new advanced reactor being built in the US in decades. And this is going to be finished construction this year in a matter of months and turn on, go critical early next year. And recently that team achieved a historic approval. They were the first new reactor design the DOE has ever approved for construction since the DOE was formed in 1977. And we actually recruited a bunch of the core people from the MARVEL team to Aalo. And what we're doing is we're building a scaled up, more commercial version. And so the Aalo 1 is our first reactor. This is a 10 megawatt electric, 30 megawatt thermal microreactor. And this will be essentially starting construction on a commercial revenue generating version within 3 years, which is the same time frame that essentially MARVEL achieved in the government setting. And so that's the approach we're taking. The initial markets we're going after will be data centers, desalination plants, decarbonizing oil and gas processes, And eventually, with our second product, this will be the Aalo 2. That will be 100 megawatt electric, and that's what we'll go after the utility market with. Because we think that'll achieve just the right balance between economy of scale and economy of numbers. And so that's the approach we're taking. And we'd love to chat with anyone who's interested in diving into our technology or collaborating or joining the team.
Yeah, that was great. I do want to push on one piece, not in a bad way, but just to further kind of like have people get an understanding of this, and maybe we can like throw up an image at this point. But Aalo 1 and then maybe even Aalo 2, like size, like just contextualize this for people. Like how big is this going to be, at scale? And then it's like 10 megawatts for, electric, and then it's 30 thermal. Comparisons, like what would it take to kind of generate that level with other sources?
Yeah, that's a good point. So physically, the Aalo 1 reactor, the 10 megawatt electric one, will fit within a shipping container. So it's very small. The overall plant size will be less than an acre, including all the other equipment and so on. So this really is kind of a parking lot sized reactor. And this could power about 10,000 homes. So it's about that kind of size. And the Aalo 2, the interesting thing is the scaling of energy is more than linear with the scaling of physical size. So the reactor, the Aalo 2, the 100 megawatt electric, even though it's 10 times the power output, will be only roughly double the physical size. And so that's another key point. And what was the other question? It was in terms of, comparison, yeah. So, if we compare what the Aalo 1 is replacing, this is essentially something that fits in a shipping container, yet can replace a square kilometer of solar panels. And keep in mind, with those solar panels, they might not work as well when it's cloudy or wouldn't work at all when it's nighttime. And so there comes all these complications where if you really want to compare apples to apples, you'd have to do extra solar panels and batteries and a complex system versus this one small shipping container sized reactor that's just as safe as a nuclear reactor that's on a university campus. So that's really what we're trying to achieve with the Aalo 1.
Fantastic. I don't know how people can't get really excited about this, to be able to kind of create power at that level, and do it in a shipping container size essentially, and then like on this acre of land, is incredible. So you guys are crushing it so far, and really looking forward to seeing what happens in the future. Matt, this was great. I appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything that we didn't jump into today that you feel is important that our community knows?
I think we touched on it all. I think those are great questions, Drew, and really appreciate you having me on.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.